The Keth Interrogation Bureau had a manual. This was not unusual. Every serious intelligence organization maintained procedural documentation, and the Keth were serious in the way that species are serious when they have spent 300 years refining a process through trial and application and the slow accumulation of what worked and what did not. The manual was 412 pages long. It covered physical methods, psychological methods, chemical methods, sensory methods, and a final chapter on what the Bureau called environmental compression, which was a clinical term for the manipulation of a subject's physical environment, temperature, light, sound, space, in ways that produced over time a state of psychological vulnerability that made the other methods more effective. The manual had an appendix. The appendix was titled Subject Classification and Resistance Profiles, and it contained assessments of every species the Bureau had interrogated over 3 centuries, organized by physiological tolerance, psychological architecture, known breaking points, and estimated timelines from initial capture to usable information. The assessments were detailed and accurate and had been validated by 300 years of operational experience. The appendix did not have an entry for humanity. This was not an oversight. It was a gap in the database because the Bureau had not yet interrogated a human subject, and the Bureau's policy was not to create an entry until operational experience supported it. The gap was noted in the appendix's introduction, which listed it alongside 4 other species whose profiles were pending, and which said, with the understated precision of institutional language, profiles for the following species are under development pending first subject assessment. The human entry's development began on the morning that Warrant Officer 2nd Class Dayo Osei-Mensah of Earth's Boundary Authority was transferred from the Keth patrol vessel that had captured him to the Bureau's primary facility on Keth Varan Station. It did not develop the way the Bureau expected. Warrant Officer Osei-Mensah had been captured during a patrol exchange that had gone badly in the specific way that border incidents go badly when 2 vessels are in a contested corridor, and one of them makes a decision that the other reads as hostile, and the response escalates faster than either party's communication channel can de-escalate it. He had been on a 2-person scout vessel with his partner, Warrant Officer Priya Tanaka, when the Keth patrol had moved to intercept. The exchange had produced, in 40 seconds, a situation that neither vessel's crew had intended and that both had found themselves inside before the intention could be revised. Tanaka had gotten the emergency beacon out. Osei-Mensah had made the decision, in the 4 seconds before the Keth boarding team reached the bridge, that one of them needed to stay with the vessel and one of them needed to go with the Keth, and that going with the Keth was the worse option and therefore the one that should fall to him because he was the senior warrant officer and senior warrant officers took the worse option. He had transmitted to Tanaka a single code that meant, "Get out, get the beacon to someone, come back for me." He had then put his hands up and waited for the boarding team to reach him, and he had been in those 4 seconds afraid in the specific way of someone who knows exactly what they are afraid of and has decided to do the thing they are afraid of anyway because the alternative is for someone else to do it, and that is the worse option. He was 34 years old. He had been in the Boundary Authority for 11 years. He had a sister in Nairobi and parents in Lagos, and a small apartment on the orbital station that he shared with no one except a plant he had named Gerald, which he had owned for 6 years and which he had with some effort kept alive, and which was the first thing he thought of when the boarding team's restraints went on, and he understood that he was going to be somewhere for a while where Gerald would not be watered. The Bureau's intake process was thorough. Osei-Mensah was processed in the standard manner: biometrics, physiological assessment, species classification, preliminary psychological screening, and assigned to a senior interrogator named Vethrall, who had been with the Bureau for 22 years and who had conducted first subject assessments for 11 of the appendix's current entries. Vethrall reviewed the preliminary screening and the available intelligence on human physiology and psychology that the Bureau's research division had compiled from open-source assembly databases, which was not extensive but was sufficient to establish baseline parameters. The baseline parameters suggested similar pain threshold to several mid-range species in the appendix, with the caveat that human pain response showed higher individual variation than most species, meaning the baseline was a population average and any specific subject might fall significantly above or below it. Psychological architecture was assessed as standard bilateral social species, attachment-based, with significant sensitivity to isolation and to threats directed at people the subject cared about. The research division's note on psychological methods concluded with the observation that human subjects, based on available behavioral data, were likely to respond well to rapport-based approaches combined with controlled pressure, and that the combination of social isolation and periodic human-analog interaction was likely to produce the fastest results. Vethrall read the assessment, noted the recommendations, and proceeded with the standard first-session protocol, which was designed to establish baseline response, identify the subject's primary pressure points, and begin the psychological positioning that would make subsequent sessions more efficient. The first session lasted 4 hours. Vethrall filed his session report that evening. The report was professional and precise. Its final paragraph said, "Subject response in first session was atypical. Recommend review of approach before second session." Supervisor's annotation on the report added the following morning said, "Explain atypical." Vethrall's response said, "Subject spent the majority of the session asking me questions." The questions had begun approximately 40 minutes into the first session, after the standard opening protocols. The establishment of the subject's identity, the recitation of the Bureau's authority, the initial demonstration of what the Bureau was capable of and willing to do. Osei-Mensah had listened to all of this with the specific quality of attention that Vethrall had noted in his report as alert without being reactive, which was not a combination the manual described as a standard subject response. Then, in the first pause after the demonstration phase, Osei-Mensah had said, in standard galactic that was accented but functional, "You've been doing this a long time." Vethrall had not responded because the manual's guidance on subject-initiated communication in the early session phase was to not engage, on the grounds that engagement rewarded the behavior and rewarded behavior repeated. Osei-Mensah had waited for a moment and then said, "I'm not asking for rapport, I'm asking because you look tired." Vethrall had looked at him. This was not a thing subjects said. In 22 years and 11 first subject assessments and hundreds of subsequent sessions, Vethrall had heard many things from subjects in the early phase: defiance, fear, negotiation attempts, silence, in a few cases laughter that was not genuine, but he had not heard a subject observe that he looked tired and frame it as concern. He had not responded. Osei-Mensah had said, "You don't have to answer, I was just noticing." Then he had said nothing for the following 20 minutes, which was when the next phase began, and after that phase he had said, "Is this difficult for you?" Vethrall had said because he had decided that controlled engagement was preferable to the silence that the subject appeared comfortable in. "What do you mean?" Osei-Mensah had said, "I mean the work, not what you're doing to me specifically, the work in general. Whether it's something you find," he had paused, searching for the standard galactic word, "whether you find it weighs on you." Vethrall had terminated the session at that point and written his report and recommended a review. The review was conducted by Bureau Director Shalken, who was 61 years old and had administered the Bureau for 14 years, and who had, in those 14 years, reviewed a great many session reports, and had developed the specific skill of reading between the lines of professional language to understand what the language was actually describing. She read Vethrall's report and then she read it again and then she requested the session recordings and watched 40 minutes of them, and then she called Vethrall into her office and asked him to describe in his own words what had happened. He described it. She listened. She said he was asking if you were okay. Vethrall said yes, she said genuinely. Vethrall said, "I believe so, yes," she said, "based on what?" He said 22 years of reading subjects. He was not performing. He was not running a counterinterrogation approach. She said, he was asking if you were okay. Vethrall said yes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "And how were you?" Vethrall said, "I don't understand the question." She said, "When he asked if the work weighed on you, how were you?" He looked at her. He said, "That is not a relevant variable in session analysis." She said, "I know, I'm asking anyway." He was quiet. He said, "I've been doing this for 22 years. She said, "Yes." He said, "That's not an answer." She said, "It might be." She looked at the session recording, which she had paused on a frame where Osei-Mensah was watching Vethrall with the specific quality of attention that she had now seen twice on the recording, and that she could not categorize correctly using the Bureau's standard subject-response taxonomy because the taxonomy had been built for responses to the Bureau, and what she was looking at was not a response to the Bureau. It was something directed at Vethrall specifically, at the person in the room rather than at the institution he represented, and the taxonomy did not have a category for that because in 22 years of sessions, it had not previously been necessary to distinguish between the two. The second session was assigned to a different interrogator, a junior officer named Keth, who was 28 years old and had been with the Bureau for 3 years, and who had been told in the briefing before the session that the subject was atypical and that standard protocols should be applied with additional documentation of any deviations from expected response. Keth applied the standard protocols. The subject's response deviated from expected response within the first 20 minutes. The deviation was not resistance in the standard sense. Osei-Mensah did not refuse to answer questions. did not become hostile, did not employ the counterinterrogation techniques that the manual described as common subject strategies. He answered questions with the partial, careful honesty of someone who was giving real information in the real order of his actual priorities, which meant he was giving the information that was least operationally sensitive first and working toward the rest, which was a standard approach and one the manual described, but which he was doing while also simultaneously asking Keth questions. Not about the Bureau. Not about the Keth's strategic situation or the information they wanted from him or the processes they were using on him. About Keth. He asked how long Keth had been doing this work. He asked whether Keth had chosen it or been assigned to it. When Keth, following the manual's guidance, did not engage, Osei-Mensah said, "You don't have to answer, I find myself curious about people. It's a thing I do, I'm sorry if it's inconvenient." Keth filed his session report. The report's final paragraph said, "Subject continues atypical response pattern. Subject appears to be genuinely interested in interrogating personnel as people rather than as institutional representatives. This does not appear to be a strategy. It appears to be a characteristic. Recommend psychological assessment consultation." The psychological assessment consultant who reviewed the report was a Keth academic named Dr. Voschen, who had been retained by the Bureau for 3 years, and who read the report and watched the recordings and said, in her consultation memo, "I need to see the next session myself." Dr. Voschen attended the third session as an observer. She watched from the monitoring room where the recordings were made, with the specific quality of attention that she brought to all research observations. Thorough, patient, and carefully free of premature interpretation, because she had learned over 30 years of academic work that the interpretations you arrive at before the observation is complete are the interpretations that make you miss things. Osei-Mensah had been in Bureau custody for 2 days at this point. He had slept in the periods between sessions, which was not standard subject behavior. Most subjects in the first 48 hours did not sleep, because the physiological stress of their situation and the psychological processing of that stress consumed the neurological resources that sleep required. He had eaten the food provided in the amounts that suggested he had decided eating was important regardless of how he felt, which was a decision rather than an appetite. He had, in the monitoring logs between sessions, spoken to himself occasionally in a language the Bureau's translation system identified as Yoruba, which was one of Earth's regional languages, and the translations of what he said were a list of people's names delivered quietly like items on a list being checked, a repeated phrase that translated approximately as it is fine, which appeared to be self-directed, and twice a single word that the translation system rendered as Gerald, which had no referent in the Bureau's intelligence files on the subject, and which Dr. Voschen noted in her observation log as an unknown personal reference, possibly a person, possibly a place, clearly something the subject found grounding to name. In the third session, conducted again by Vethrall, Osei-Mensah spent the first 10 minutes answering questions in the same partial, ordered way he had been answering them, and then in a pause said to Vethrall, "You came back." Vethrall said, "Yes." "Oh." Osei-Mensah said, "You didn't have to." Vethrall said, "It's my assignment." Osei-Mensah said, "I know, I meant." He paused. He said, "I'm glad it's you." Vethrall said nothing. In the monitoring room, Dr. Voschen wrote in her observation log, "I need to understand what is happening here." What Dr. Voschen wrote in her consultation report, after the third session, after 30 hours of reviewing recordings and cross-referencing the Bureau's psychological literature and her own academic work on social species stress responses, was not what the Bureau had asked her to produce. The Bureau had asked her to produce an assessment of the subject's psychological profile and recommendations for approach optimization. She produced those things. They were in the report's first 3 sections. The fourth section was not what the Bureau had asked for, and she included it anyway because she was a consultant and not a Bureau employee, and the terms of her consultancy permitted her to include relevant observations outside the scope of the specific request, and she had decided that what she had observed was relevant. The fourth section's heading was a note on the subject's apparent orientation. It said, in the academic language she used when she wanted precision without the appearance of advocacy, the subject's consistent redirection of interaction toward the well-being of Bureau personnel is, in my 30 years of working with interrogation subjects from 14 species, without precedent. I want to be careful about the interpretation I offer, because the observation is genuine, but the interpretation carries significant uncertainty. The available interpretations are: 1. The subject is employing a sophisticated counterinterrogation strategy designed to destabilize the interrogator's professional distance, which is a known technique but which I have not observed executed with this degree of apparent authenticity. 2. The subject is experiencing a dissociative response to his situation that is redirecting his distress outward rather than allowing him to process it internally, which is a known stress response, but which typically produces unfocused or irrational behavior rather than the coherent, targeted behavior I have observed. Or 3. The subject is genuinely, non-strategically oriented toward the well-being of the people around him, including the people who are causing him harm, and this orientation is a characteristic of his psychology rather than a product of his situation. I cannot rule out interpretations 1 or 2. I am including interpretation 3 because I observed the third session in its entirety, and I observed Vethral's face when the subject said he was glad it was him, and Vethral has been doing this work for 22 years, and what I observed on his face is not something I can attribute to a subject's strategy. I am a scientist and I document what I observe. I observed that. On the morning of the third day, Bureau Director Shalken called a review meeting that included Vethral, Keth, Dr. Vosschen, and the Bureau's Deputy Director. A methodical being named Oralshen who had been with the Bureau for 30 years, and who had in those 30 years participated in more review meetings than he could count, and who had never been in a review meeting quite like this one. The meeting began with a review of the operational status, what information had been obtained, what remained outstanding, what the Bureau's assessment was of the subject's remaining intelligence value. The operational review was conducted in the standard manner and produced the standard kind of output. The meeting then moved to the approach review, which was the part that was not standard. Vethral presented his session reports. Keth presented his. Dr. Vosschen presented her consultation report, including the fourth section, which she read aloud rather than summarizing because she believed the specific language mattered. When she finished, the meeting was quiet for a moment. Then Deputy Director Oralshen said, "He's been asking if you're okay." Vethral said yes. Oralshen said, "For 3 days." Vethral said yes. Oralshen said, "While we were." Vethral said yes. Oralshen looked at the table for a moment. He said, "What does he want? Not tactically. Not strategically. As a person, what does he want from these conversations?" It was a question the Bureau's review process did not typically ask, and the room registered this by being quiet for longer than review meetings were usually quiet. Then Dr. Vosschen said, "I think he wants to know that the people around him are all right. I think it is genuinely that simple." Oralshen said, "We are hurting him." She said yes. He said, "And he is asking if we are all right." She said yes. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That is either the most sophisticated thing I have ever heard of a subject doing or the most." He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence, she said. "Or the most human," he said yes. The question of what to do with the information they had obtained, and what to do with the subject, was resolved not in the review meeting, but in a separate conversation that took place 2 hours after the meeting, between Bureau Director Shalken and the Keth Dominion's intelligence liaison, whose name was not included in the Bureau's records of the conversation, but whose authority was sufficient to authorize the decision that was reached. The decision was reached quickly, which was unusual for decisions of this kind, and the reason it was reached quickly was that the intelligence liaison, after being briefed on the 3 days of sessions and the consultation report and the review meeting, had said, "What is your assessment of continued detention?" Shalken had said, "Operationally, we have obtained the highest priority intelligence within the subject's knowledge. Further sessions are unlikely to produce material of significant additional value." The liaison had said, "And non-operationally." Shalken had said, "Non-operationally, I have a senior interrogator who has been doing this work for 22 years and who came to my office this morning and asked me whether I thought the work was something that weighed on a person." She had paused. She said, "I have never had an interrogator ask me that before." The liaison had been quiet. He said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him I thought the work was important and that important work was sometimes difficult." He said, "And what did he say?" She said, "He said yes. He said that was probably right. He said he was going to think about it." She said, "He has been doing this work for 22 years and he is going to think about it because a subject in detention asked him if he was okay." The liaison said, "Release the subject." She said, "The subject is a military intelligence asset who has information about." He said, "Release the subject through the standard exchange channel. File it as a humanitarian release pending formal corridor access negotiations. The paperwork will support it." She said, "The paperwork will support it because it is not inaccurate." He said yes. She said, "And the actual reason?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I have been doing this job for 30 years and I want to know what happens when that man goes home. I want to know what he does next. I want to understand what kind of person asks if his captors are okay and means it, and I think the only way to understand that is to see what he does when he doesn't have to." Warrant Officer Second Class Dayo Osei-Mensah was transferred to the Standard Exchange Channel on the morning of the fourth day, and returned to Earth's Boundary Authority custody at 1400 hours that afternoon. His partner, Warrant Officer Priya Tanaka, had in the 3 days of his detention managed to get the emergency beacon to a Boundary Authority relay station, which had transmitted to a patrol vessel, which had reached the exchange negotiation through the Galactic Assembly's Standard Detention and Exchange Protocol. The exchange had taken 3 days longer than standard because the Keth Bureau had not immediately confirmed detention, which was a delay the Boundary Authority's legal division had flagged for formal protest, and which the Keth intelligence liaison had authorized the Bureau to accept responsibility for in the exchange documentation, because accepting responsibility for a processing delay was the accurate account of what had caused it. Osei-Mensah was examined by the Boundary Authority's medical team and found to have injuries consistent with 3 days of Bureau detention and to be in the medical officer's assessment, better psychological condition than was typically observed in subjects returning from Bureau custody. The medical officer noted this in the intake report and attributed it to individual variation in stress response, which was accurate as far as it went. Osei-Mensah was given food that he ate without the deliberate quality he had applied to eating in detention, which was the specific quality of eating when you are hungry and the food is good and you are not calculating whether eating is important. He asked about Gerald. His colleagues who had been in the exchange facility waiting for him and who did not know what Gerald was said, "What?" He said, "My plant. Someone watered it." His colleague said, "Tanaka asked the station maintenance team." He said, "Good." He nodded. He said, "Good." Then he was quiet for a while and the medical team gave him space, and he sat in the space and was somewhere that was not the Bureau's facility and was quiet in the specific way of someone who had been somewhere very loud for 3 days and had arrived, finally, at the quiet they had been keeping for themselves while the loud was happening. He filed his debrief report the following week, after the medical clearance and the standard recovery period. The report was thorough, professionally written, and contained the operational intelligence he had retained from the Bureau's sessions, information about what the Bureau had asked, which told the Boundary Authority's Intelligence Division what the Bureau wanted to know, which was itself intelligence. The report also contained, in a section labeled Personal Observations, something that debrief reports did not typically contain, because debrief protocols covered operational matters and personal observations were considered outside the scope. Osei-Mensah had included the section anyway, and the debrief officer had not removed it, because the debrief officer had read it and had decided that it was, despite being outside the standard scope, relevant to something, though she was not certain what. The section said, "I want to note for the record that the Bureau personnel I was in contact with during my detention were, in my observation, people doing a job that they had not all chosen and that not all of them found easy, and that the difficulty was visible in ways they were not trying to hide, which suggests they were not aware that it was visible, which suggests that no one had asked them about it in a way that made them look at it directly. I am not saying this to advocate for any particular treatment of Bureau personnel or to suggest any operational conclusion. I am saying it because I spent 3 days paying attention to the people in the room with me, and what I observed was that they were people, and that the people were dealing with something, and that the something was real, and that I think the record should contain the observation that it was real, because real things that go unobserved have a way of becoming larger than real things that are seen and named. I do not know what the Bureau's personnel do with what their work costs them. I hope someone asks." The debrief officer read this section and sat with it for a while. Then she stamped the report approved and filed it and went home and called her mother, which was something she had been meaning to do for 2 weeks and had not done. And she did not think about why she did it that night specifically, but she did it. And her mother was glad she called, and they talked for an hour about things that were not work. And it was good, and the goodness of it was the kind of goodness that exists in ordinary things when you have been recently reminded that ordinary things are not guaranteed. And that the people you love are worth asking about, and that asking is not nothing, and that sometimes asking is the whole thing and the whole thing is enough. Bureau Director Shalken retired from the Bureau 4 years after the Osei-Mensah detention. She had been planning to retire in 6 years, and she moved the timeline forward for a reason she described to the Bureau's deputy director, who asked, "I have been administering this Bureau for 18 years, and I am going to spend the next period of my life doing something else. And I am making that decision now rather than in 6 years, because a subject in detention asked Vethral if he was okay, and Vethral came to my office, and I told him the work was important, and that was true, and it was not enough. Oralshan, the deputy director who had been in the bureau for 30 years and who had attended the review meeting and had been the one to say, or the most human, said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "I don't know yet, something that has a different shape." He said, "And Vethral?" She said, "Vethral has been thinking about it." She said, "He told me last week that he has been thinking about it since the session." I asked what he had concluded. He said he had not concluded anything yet. He said he was still thinking. She said, "He has been doing this work for 22 years and a subject asked him if he was okay and he is still thinking about it." She paused. She said, "I think that is the correct response. I think still thinking is the right place to be." Oralshan looked at her for a moment. He said, "The subject." He said it like he was asking and not asking. She said, "I read the follow-up file. He's back on patrol. He's been cited for commendation twice in the past 4 years, both times for what the citations describe as exceptional situational awareness and calm under pressure." She said, "Exceptional situational awareness." Oralshan said, "Yes." She said, "He spent 3 days in our facility asking if our people were okay and they are citing him for situational awareness." Oralshan said, "It is accurate." She said, "I know, that's what I keep thinking about, how accurate it is." Dr. Vosschen published, 3 years after the consultation, a paper in the Assembly's Journal of Applied Xenopsychology titled Interrogation-Resistant Psychological Orientations in Non-Warrior Caste Species, a case study in human subject response. The paper was careful and precise and contained all the appropriate academic qualifications and did not claim more than the evid. NSE supported. It was based on the Osei-Mensah sessions, anonymized to the degree the Bureau's classification protocols permitted, and it was, in the xenopsychology community's assessment, a significant contribution to the literature on human psychological architecture. The paper's most cited passage, the one that appeared in subsequent work more frequently than any other, was from its conclusion, and it said, "The case study subject's persistent orientation toward the well-being of Bureau personnel during his detention is not adequately explained by any of the standard frameworks for subject behavior under interrogation stress. The closest analogous behavior in the existing literature is the phenomenon of hostage-captor bonding, but that phenomenon is characterized by a subject's adoption of the captor's perspective as a survival strategy, and the subject in this case did not adopt the Bureau's perspective. He maintained his own clearly and consistently throughout. What he did was hold his own perspective and the Bureau personnel's humanity simultaneously, without allowing the first to erase the second or the second to compromise the first. This is not a strategy. Strategies can be disrupted by changing conditions. This did not change with conditions. It was present in the first session and the third session and in the monitoring logs between sessions and in the debrief report that the subject filed a week after his return to his own custody. It was a characteristic. The characteristic in the available literature is not well documented in human subjects because the circumstances required to observe it are not circumstances that occur frequently, and when they occur the documentation is typically operational rather than psychological. This paper is an attempt to add to that documentation. The characteristic deserves to be documented because it is, in this researcher's assessment, not incidental to what humanity is. It may be central to it. The distinction matters, and I leave it to subsequent researchers to determine whether the evidence supports the stronger claim. Vethral retired from the Bureau 7 years after the Osei-Mensah detention. He had been thinking about it for 7 years, which was the accurate account of what he had been doing, and at the end of 7 years he had arrived at something that was not a conclusion but was a direction, and a direction was enough to move in. He spent the following years working for an organization that the Keth Dominion maintained for the reintegration of former prisoners. A civilian organization, not affiliated with any intelligence body, funded by a combination of Dominion social services and private contributions, staffed mostly by former military and intelligence personnel who had decided, at various points in their careers, that the direction they wanted to move in was toward rather than away. He had not expected to be good at it. He was good at it. He had not expected to find it easier than the Bureau work. It was not easier. It was different in a way that mattered to him in a way he did not fully articulate to anyone, but that was visible to the people who worked with him and who described him, in the organization's internal reviews, as someone who paid attention to people. As someone who noticed when someone was not all right and asked about it directly without performing the asking. As someone who had learned somewhere to look at the people in the room and see them as people, and to treat that seeing as the work rather than as the background to the work. He did not tell his colleagues where he had learned it. He thought about it sometimes, sitting in his office in the evenings, in the specific quality of late-day quiet that offices have when the work of the day is done and the weight of it is present but manageable, the way weight is manageable when you are not alone in carrying it. He thought about a subject who had sat across from him for 3 days and had looked at him and had asked, in standard galactic with an accent that was warmer than the language usually allowed, "Is this difficult for you?" He thought about what it had meant that someone had asked. He thought about what it had meant that he had not had an answer. He thought about the 7 years he had spent finding one. The answer was yes, it had been difficult. It had been difficult for 22 years and he had not known how to name that until someone asked, and the naming had been the beginning of the direction. And the direction had brought him here to this office, to this work, to the people in the room who needed someone to notice them and ask. And he noticed them, and he asked, and they answered, and the answering was the whole thing, and the whole thing was enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, share it with a fellow HFY fan, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Your support keeps these stories coming.